On an autumn afternoon, colorful leaves were falling in the garden of Margaret Coleman's house in a residential area of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Margaret sat by the window, pausing her knitting as she gazed at the gradually fading sunlight. It had been 3 years since she lost her husband Robert, and she had been living alone in this house ever since, but she looked forward to her granddaughter Emily's weekend visits more than anything. "Today is the day Emily comes," Margaret whispered softly. Her meticulous nature as a retired librarian remained unchanged. She checked the clock and headed to the kitchen, where the aroma of chocolate chip cookies was already wafting through the air. They were Emily's favorite. The doorbell rang, and Margaret hurried to the entrance. "Grandma." As soon as the door opened, 7-year-old Emily wrapped her arms around Margaret's waist. The little arms squeezed her tightly. Margaret smiled and gently kissed her granddaughter's hair. "Emily, I've missed you." Behind Emily stood Margaret's son Jason and his partner Valerie. Jason had made a name for himself as a successful local architect. Valerie was a beautiful woman who always maintained a perfect appearance and never-ending smile. However, Margaret always felt uncomfortable that the smile never quite reached her eyes. "Mom, how are you?" Jason said, giving Margaret a light hug. "Fine, just the same as always," Margaret replied, and also greeted Valerie. "Valerie, you're looking well." "Yes, Margaret." "Nothing's changed," Valerie smiled politely, but there was something cold in her eyes. "Well, come on in. I baked cookies, Emily." Emily's face lit up. "Chocolate chip?" "Yes, your favorite." As the family entered the living room, Margaret observed Emily. She seemed to be missing some of her usual brightness. Normally, Emily would head straight for the kitchen, but today she sat quietly in the corner of the sofa, hugging her stuffed animal. That stuffed animal was the last gift from Emily's late mother. It was her favorite pink rabbit, which she always cherished. But today, she seemed to be holding it more tightly than usual. "Emily, how's school?" Margaret asked gently. Emily shrugged slightly. "It's okay." "Have you made any new friends?" Emily didn't answer, continuing to stare at her stuffed animal. Instead, Valerie spoke up. "Emily is a bit shy. But her teachers say she's a good girl. Right, Emily?" Emily nodded silently. Margaret felt concern in her chest as she noticed something in the child's expression. "Valerie, are you busy with work?" Margaret changed the subject. "Yes, I've become the head of the marketing department and been assigned major projects. So I sometimes have to rely on Jason for things around the house," Valerie answered with a perfect smile. "Val is really talented," Jason looked at his wife proudly. "Thanks to her, Emily is positively influenced too. Right, Emily?" Margaret didn't miss how Emily's shoulders tensed slightly. While preparing dinner, Margaret watched the backyard through the kitchen window. While Jason was on his cell phone taking a business call, Valerie was with Emily. She seemed to be talking to the child, but Emily was still holding her stuffed animal and hardly responding. Dinner proceeded lively, but it was filled with topics from Jason and Valerie. The two talked enthusiastically about their work and social lives, while Emily continued eating mostly in silence. Margaret gently spoke to her granddaughter several times, but Emily only answered in short phrases, with the stuffed animal placed on her lap. "Emily, shall we go to the park tomorrow?" Margaret suggested after the meal. Emily's eyes brightened for the first time. "Yes, I'd like that." "Will you come too, Valerie?" Margaret asked. "I'm sorry, but I need to prepare some work materials tomorrow," Valerie replied regretfully. "But Emily, enjoy your time with Grandma." "Yes," Emily answered quietly. There was a slight relief mixed in her voice. When the family was leaving, Margaret hugged Emily once more. "See you tomorrow, Emily." "Yes, Grandma," Emily smiled. The smile was brief, but genuine. As Margaret closed the door and watched them from the window, complex emotions swirled in her heart. Something had changed. Emily becoming more introverted might be part of growing up, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper going on. Margaret sat in the living room chair, thinking about tomorrow's visit. Perhaps during her time alone with Emily, she might find some clues to what was going on in her granddaughter's heart. "Something's wrong," Margaret whispered quietly. "Grandma will definitely help you." Margaret looked at the gradually darkening sky, deciding to wait for tomorrow. As promised, Emily came to Margaret's house the next morning. She ran up to Margaret. Today too, she was carrying the pink rabbit stuffed animal. "Dad and Valerie have errands until evening today," Jason said, leaning out the car window. "Emily, be sure to listen to Grandma." "Okay," Emily nodded. Margaret waved to Jason and put her arm around Emily's shoulders. "Well, let's go inside. Let's have breakfast together before going to the park." Once inside, Emily sat on the living room sofa, placing her stuffed animal on her lap. Margaret brought orange juice and French toast from the kitchen. "Emily, you seem more cheerful than yesterday," Margaret smiled. Emily laughed a little and answered in a small voice, "I like Grandma's house." "I'm glad to hear that."
Can you imagine making $10,000 a month just from YouTube, all from home? That's exactly what I did with Reddit Stories. No face, no voice. Check the link in the description if you're curious.
During breakfast, Margaret carefully observed Emily. She seemed to be avoiding family topics, and when asked about school or friends, she only gave short answers. However, when talking about favorite books or the library, her face brightened a little. "Emily, you treasure that stuffed animal, don't you?" Margaret asked gently. Emily looked at the stuffed animal, gently stroking its ears. "Yes, Pinky is special. Because it was a gift from Mom." Emily's expression clouded for a moment. She seemed to react to the word "Mom." But she quickly regained her composure. "Shall we go to the park?" Emily said, as if changing the subject. "Of course," Margaret answered, but kept her granddaughter's reaction in mind. The neighborhood park was wrapped in autumn colors. Margaret and Emily walked through the fallen leaves, and occasionally Emily happily picked up colorful leaves. Pinky was with her, and Emily sometimes showed the leaves to her stuffed animal. "Does Pinky like pretty leaves too?" Margaret asked. Emily nodded with a serious face. "Pinky understands everything. That's why I can talk to him." Margaret smiled at her granddaughter's imagination, but felt there might be a deeper meaning to her words. While pushing Emily on the swing, Margaret casually asked, "How is it with your new mom? Have you gotten used to Valerie?" The swing slightly stopped its motion. Emily's small hands gripped the chains tightly. "Valerie is always busy," Emily looked down. "Dad says Valerie is thinking of you, but..." Margaret gently prompted. "But..." Emily broke off. "Pinky is waiting. I want to play over there." Emily jumped off the swing and ran towards the slide. Margaret didn't pursue it further, but her concern grew over her granddaughter's reaction. After lunch, back at home, Emily looked a bit tired. While Margaret was preparing afternoon tea, Emily began drawing in the living room. Margaret watched quietly, and noticed Emily was drawing a family picture. On the left side of the paper was Jason, next to him a small Emily, and to Emily's right, Valerie drawn larger. Valerie's image was disproportionately large, and while her face had a smile, her eyes were strangely emphasized. And at the edge of the drawing, slightly apart, a single pink stuffed animal was drawn, all alone. "That's a lovely picture, Emily," Margaret said gently. "Is this everyone?" Emily silently nodded. "Is this Rabbit Pinky? Why is he so far away?" Emily didn't look up from the drawing and gripped her crayon tightly. "Pinky can't be with me at Dad's house." "Why not?" Emily remained silent, taking another color crayon. There was tension in her movement. "Did someone say you can't be with Pinky?" Margaret asked quietly. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she seemed to be desperately holding them back. Valerie. Valerie says Pinky is dirty, and I have to throw him away when I grow up. Margaret's heart ached. But Pinky is a present from your mom, isn't he? Valerie doesn't care about that, Emily murmured softly. But promise me. Grandma, don't tell Valerie. I'll get scolded. I promise, Emily, Margaret said. Further doubts were growing in her mind. Later in the afternoon, Jason and Valerie came to pick Emily up. Margaret noticed that Emily carefully tucked Pinky into her backpack, making sure Valerie couldn't see it. Did you have fun, Emily? Valerie asked brightly. Yes, Emily answered softly. What did you do? Went to the park, drew pictures. Pictures? What kind of pictures did you draw? Valerie's voice suddenly took on a sharp tone. Emily seemed to flinch for a moment. Trees, and flowers. Can I see them? Valerie was smiling, but there was coldness in her gaze. Margaret spoke up instinctively. I'm sorry, we spilled water on the pictures. Let's draw again another day, Emily. Emily looked relieved, while Valerie frowned momentarily. Margaret looked at Jason, but he was focused on his smartphone, seemingly unaware of this subtle atmosphere. Well, let's go, Jason said. Mom, thanks for today. You're welcome. Come anytime, Emily. Emily nodded slightly and quietly hugged Margaret. At that moment, Margaret heard a faint whisper from her granddaughter, I want to come again. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. Emily's demeanor, Valerie's attitude, and Jason's obliviousness wouldn't leave her mind. She looked up at the night sky from the living room window, trying to organize her thoughts. Emily's change clearly seemed related to Valerie. Valerie appeared perfect on the surface, but there might be some problem between her and Emily. However, it could just be an adjustment period between a stepmother and daughter, or Margaret's own excessive worry. Still, the image of Emily trying to hide Pinky, the fear when mentioning Valerie's name, and above all, the words, don't tell Valerie. I'll get scolded, bothered her. Margaret considered her role. She shouldn't be overly involved in her son's household, but Emily's happiness was the priority. Without evidence, it would just be dismissed as overthinking. I must watch more carefully, Margaret quietly resolved. To protect Emily. The family came again on the weekend. Jason's car stopped at the entrance, and Emily was the first to jump out. Valerie was with them today. Margaret greeted them on the porch. Hello, everyone, Margaret smiled. Emily ran to Margaret and hugged her. In her arms was the familiar stuffed animal. When Valerie saw the stuffed animal, she frowned for just a moment, but quickly regained her smile. Margaret didn't miss this change in expression. We'll be intruding today, Margaret, Valerie said elegantly. Emily, bring your things. Emily obeyed Valerie's instruction, still carrying her small backpack. Jason took out a large paper bag from the car. Mom, I brought wine and cheese. Let's relax tonight. As the three entered the house, Margaret gently took Emily's arm and whispered in her ear, there are new books in your room. Want to go see? Emily's face brightened, and the two headed to the upstairs guest room. It used to be Jason's room, but now it was Emily's room when she stayed over. Children's books chosen by Margaret lined the bookshelf next to the bed. Wow! Emily picked up a new picture book, her eyes sparkling. Do you like it? Yes. Read it to me. Margaret sat on the bed with Emily and opened the book. While reading aloud, Emily was holding Pinky tightly. Margaret casually asked, is Pinky listening to the story too? Emily nodded. Pinky hears everything. Do you talk to Pinky often? Emily looked a bit wary, glancing at the door. Yes, but it's a secret. Why a secret? Emily silently shook her head. Read more, she said, changing the subject. That evening, after dinner, Valerie and Jason were talking in the living room, drinking wine. Margaret was cleaning up in the kitchen, and Emily was playing upstairs. She's really a capable person, Jason's voice came from the living room. Thanks to her, the company's project is on track. You're the talented one, Jay, Valerie's sweet voice. I'm just providing support. No, without you. Margaret sighed. Her son seemed too infatuated with Valerie to see anything else. She quietly climbed the stairs to check on Emily. Emily's room door was slightly open. As Margaret approached, she heard a small voice from inside. Emily was talking alone. No, she was talking to Pinky. Mom. Emily's voice was trembling. Dad won't listen. Because Valerie says he'll get angry. Margaret stopped, holding her breath. Emily was calling the stuffed animal, Mom. Mom, I'm scared. When I cry, Valerie says, you're stealing your father's time. She's nice in front of Dad, but when Dad's not there. Emily's voice became smaller, turning into sobs. Mom, that's secret, do you think Grandma would be angry if I told her? Margaret's hands trembled, her heart pounding. She gently pushed the door and entered the room. Emily. Emily turned around startled, trying quickly to hide the stuffed animal. There were traces of tears on her face. Gee, Grandma. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and said gently, It's okay, Emily. You haven't done anything wrong. Emily looked at Margaret with anxious eyes. You were talking to Pinky, Margaret continued quietly. That's a lovely thing. Pinky is a gift from Mom. Emily finally looked a bit relieved and brought out the stuffed animal. Valerie laughs at me. Says I'm childish. You're only 7 years old. Talking to stuffed animals is very natural, Margaret said. Emily, if there's anything troubling you, you can tell Grandma. Emily remained silent, staring at the stuffed animal on her lap. Do you have a secret? Margaret asked carefully. The secret you were telling Pinky. Emily's small shoulders trembled. Valerie. Valerie scares me. Why does she scare you? When Dad's not around, Valerie tells me you're a burden to Jason. Because of you, we can't be a perfect family. Emily's words broke off. Anger welled up in Margaret's chest, but she tried not to show it. Anything else? Does Valerie say or do anything else? When I cry at night because of scary dreams, she says, you're too weak. And Emily clutched Pinky tightly with trembling hands. She threatens to throw Pinky away. Aren't you too old for this, she says. Margaret put her arm around Emily's shoulders. Her granddaughter buried her face in Margaret's chest. You're very brave, Emily. Thank you for telling Grandma. But don't tell Dad, Emily pleaded. Dad loves Valerie so much. It would make him sad. These words pained Margaret's heart. A 7-year-old child trying to protect her father's feelings. Emily, you've done nothing wrong. This isn't your fault, Margaret said, gently stroking Emily's hair. I will protect you. Footsteps were heard outside the room, and Emily startled upright. The door opened, and Valerie peeked in. Oh, here you are, Valerie smiled, but her eyes were cold. Emily, it's bedtime. Change into your pajamas. Margaret stood up. I'll help her. No, thank you, Valerie said in a polite but firm tone. Family time is important, so we'll do it ourselves. Margaret felt the implied meaning behind those words, you are not family. But she decided it was better not to argue now. I understand. Good night, Emily, Margaret kissed Emily. See you tomorrow. As she left the room, Margaret didn't miss Emily's anxious expression. Nor did she miss seeing Valerie take Pinky from Emily's hands. Big girls sleep without stuffed animals. Valerie's words were as sweet as honey and as dangerous as poison. Margaret descended the stairs and sat on the living room sofa. She couldn't stop her hands from shaking. She felt anger and sadness that her previous suspicions had become reality. "Mom, are you okay?" Jason asked worriedly. "Yes, just a little tired," Margaret said. That night, she made a decision. She had to act to protect her granddaughter. But how could she make her son understand the truth? Without evidence, it would just seem like conflict between a mother-in-law and stepmother. Margaret looked up at the second floor. She thought she could hear a small crying voice somewhere. In the kitchen, bathed in morning sunlight, Margaret was making coffee. She had barely slept all night. Emily's confession and the question of how to deal with it wouldn't leave her mind. There was the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs, and Emily appeared. There were tired shadows under her eyes, and the stuffed animal Pinky was not in her arms. "Good morning, Emily," Margaret called gently. "Good morning, Grandma," Emily answered in a small voice. "Where's Pinky?" Emily shrugged. "Valerie put him in the bag. She said, don't carry it around in front of adults." Margaret suppressed her anger and feigned calmness. "What would you like for breakfast? Shall I make pancakes?" Emily's face brightened a little. "Yes." While preparing breakfast, Margaret formulated a plan. She needed evidence to tell her son the truth. But first, she had to gain Emily's complete trust. "Emily, I think what you told Grandma yesterday took a lot of courage," Margaret said as she plated the pancakes. Emily sat at the table and silently nodded. "Can you tell me more? What kind of things Valerie says, what kind of things she does?" Emily looked around, as if checking that no one was listening. "Valerie says, Emily, I love you, in front of Dad, but when Dad's not there, she's different." "How is she different?" "Her eyes get scary. She says, you've ruined my life." Emily poked at her plate with her fork. "When I make mistakes with homework, she says, you're really useless. You only make your father sad." Margaret's heart ached. "Have you ever told Dad about this?" Emily shook her head vigorously. "Valerie says, if you tell him, Dad won't believe you. He'll choose me." "That's not true," Margaret said, but considering her son's blindness towards Valerie, she couldn't be completely confident. Just then, the sound of two people coming down the stairs was heard. Emily suddenly tensed up and fell silent. "Good morning." Jason and Valerie entered the kitchen. "Pancakes, smells good," Jason said with a smile. "Good morning, Emily," Valerie said in a sweet voice. "Did you sleep well?" Emily nodded but didn't make eye contact. During breakfast, Margaret carefully observed Valerie. On the surface, she was playing the perfect stepmother, but when Jason was busy reading the newspaper, there was coldness in Valerie's gaze toward Emily. It was just for a moment, but it was clear to Margaret. "What shall we do today?" Jason asked. "I have an online meeting this afternoon," Valerie said. "But I'd like to go shopping before that." "Then I'll take Emily to the park," Jason said. "Would you like to come too, Mom?" "Of course," Margaret answered. "I'll come too," Valerie quickly said. "I want to spend time with the family before my meeting." Emily's expression slightly clouded. Margaret didn't miss that. At the park, Jason put Emily on a swing, and Margaret and Valerie sat on a bench. There was tension between the two women. "Does Emily cry a lot?" Margaret casually asked. "Yes, she's a bit of an emotional child," Valerie answered. "But she needs to become stronger. The world isn't kind." "Isn't that a bit harsh for a 7-year-old?" Valerie's smile froze. "Is that from your experience as a parent?" "From my experience as a mother and a grandmother," Margaret said quietly. "Children need safety and love. Of course, Valerie agreed. But there's a difference between spoiling and loving. Emily needs discipline. The conversation broke off there, but it was clear that a silent battle had begun between the two. That afternoon, when Valerie went to the upstairs study for her meeting, Margaret made herself at home in the living room where Emily and Jason were playing a board game. Emily's smile had returned. "Dad, go this way." Emily pointed at a piece. "That's cheating." Jason laughed. Margaret looked at her son's profile. When Valerie wasn't around, he showed a relaxed, natural father's face. How could she convey the truth to him? The opportunity came from an unexpected place. "Dad, get me some water," Emily said. "Yes, miss." Jason stood up and headed to the kitchen. At that moment, Margaret whispered to Emily, "Emily, what would you think if we could record what Valerie says to you?" Emily looked surprised but quickly understood. "To let Dad hear it?" "Yes. Because Dad might not believe us without evidence." Emily thought a bit, then nodded. "But how?" Margaret took out an old smartphone. "Keep this phone in your pocket. If you press the record button, it will record everything Valerie says." Before Jason returned, Margaret quickly handed the smartphone to Emily. "Try using it tomorrow when you're alone with Valerie." The next day, Jason left for work, and Margaret said she was going shopping and left the house. However, she actually waited in her car, praying that Emily had the smartphone with her. 2 hours later, when Margaret returned, Emily was quietly reading a book in the living room. Valerie was in the kitchen with her laptop open. "I'm back," Margaret said. Emily signaled with her eyes and slipped the smartphone into Margaret's pocket. That night, after Jason returned home, Margaret checked the recording in her bedroom. There was clear evidence. "You're really a nuisance," Valerie's cold voice. "Your father is sacrificing his time with me for you. Are you grateful?" Emily's small voice. "I'm sorry. Throw away that stuffed animal. Your mom is gone. It's time you faced reality." A weak protest. "But, Pinky is just garbage. If you want to remain a baby forever, what do you think your father would think? Aren't you embarrassed?" Margaret stopped the recording and took a deep breath. This was the evidence. Tonight, she would tell her son the truth. When she left the bedroom, Emily was standing in the hallway. "Grandma," Emily said with a frightened face. "Did you listen to the recording?" "Yes, I did," Margaret said. "Emily, you were very brave. Are you going to let Dad hear it?" "Yes. Dad loves you. He needs to know the truth." Emily nodded anxiously. "I'm scared." "It's okay, Grandma is with you," Margaret hugged her granddaughter. As the two headed to the living room, Jason and Valerie were sitting on the sofa. Margaret took a deep breath and prepared herself. "Jason, we need to talk." 2 weeks had passed. Margaret still vividly remembered the blood draining from Jason's face as he listened to the recording, Valerie's anger and denial, and finally her having to admit the truth. "Grandma, look." Emily came running into the living room. In her hands was a Christmas card. She had drawn candy canes and Santa Claus, and written, "To my beloved Grandma." "That's lovely, Emily," Margaret smiled. Emily had been staying at Margaret's house for several days. After Valerie left, Jason temporarily entrusted his daughter to Margaret while he sorted out his own feelings. "When is Dad coming?" Emily asked. "Soon," he called. Emily sat on the sofa, hugging Pinky. That stuffed animal was now always by her side. Emily still couldn't completely let go of her wariness, and sometimes woke up from nightmares, but she was gradually recovering. The doorbell rang, and Emily jumped up. Jason came in. His face was tired, but he smiled when he saw his daughter. "Emily." Emily flew into her father's arms. Jason held his daughter tightly and gave Margaret a grateful look. "Mom, thank you." "You're welcome." Margaret placed her hand on her son's shoulder. That night, after Emily went to bed, Jason and Margaret talked over coffee in the kitchen. "I heard from Valerie," Jason said in a tired voice. "She's demanding we get back together." "And you?" "I refused." Jason gripped his cup. "It turns out she was also harassing colleagues at work. She got fired." "I see. How did I not notice?" Jason was consumed with self-blame. The other side of her words and actions. Emily was suffering. "Don't blame yourself," Margaret said gently. "What matters is that you're on your daughter's side now." Time passed, and with the arrival of spring came a new beginning. Valerie had returned to her parents' home, but couldn't find her place there either, and eventually moved to another state, according to rumors. Emily and Jason were finding a new rhythm of life. Jason adjusted his work hours and cherished his time with his daughter. Margaret also frequently visited their home and continued to provide support. One night, as Margaret passed by Emily's bedroom, she heard a small voice. Emily was talking to Pinky. "Mom, I'm glad Grandma was here. Dad is really kind now. Everything will be okay from now on." Margaret quietly smiled and headed to her own room. Outside the window, the gentle spring breeze was scattering cherry blossom petals. With the arrival of the new season, their wounds would gradually heal. Through their suffering, they learned that true family is not just about blood ties, but about protecting and supporting each other. And also about the importance of listening to the voices of those in the most vulnerable positions. Peaceful breathing could be heard from Emily's room. With Pinky held to her chest, she had fallen asleep feeling safe for the first time, without fearing nightmares.